This is Joy Foote. Welcome to Pine Mountain, then and now. Welcome back, and I'm glad you're here because I've got a great show today. But before we jump in, I want to take a moment to honor two remarkable men whose lives left a lasting mark on me and our town. Pope Davis passed away on May 12th, just shy of his 101st birthday. Pope was a native of Chipley and a World War II vet. I had the great privilege of interviewing him in April, and I've already shared a couple of his stories in my Memory Lane segment in previous episodes. Spending that time with him was unforgettable. I'll always remember how his face would light up when he smiled, and when he got excited about a story, he'd lean forward with a spark that was just contagious. I'll continue to share more stories from him in future Memory Lane podcast segments. Rob Smith passed away on May 8th. Rob was a Vietnam vet, a gifted musician, and a beloved local figure. He toured with the Charlie Daniels Band during the Devil Went Down to Georgia era and co-owned the Bluebird Cottage on Broad Street. I always mentioned him on my walking tours. He was generous with visitors, happy to chat and pose for photos. We had a podcast interview planned before he became ill, and I'll always regret not getting the chance to record his story. If you visit the store, be sure to say hello to his wife Sharon and take a look at the framed tour photos still hanging inside. I'll miss seeing him out front with his pipe, flashing that familiar grin, and answering my usual, "How you doin'?" with his classic reply, "Just peachy." And now I'm happy to welcome today's guest, Chris Skates, author of Moonshine Over Georgia, a historical fiction novel inspired by the wild and dangerous true stories his grandfather shared about working as a revenue agent during Prohibition, right here in West Central Georgia. I read the book last year and had the chance to hear Chris give a short presentation at the Women's Club. Hearing him talk about his research, what inspired the book, and the real-life history behind it was absolutely fascinating. And I knew right then he'd be a perfect guest for the show. Thank you, Chris, for joining the show today. I'm excited to have you. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. I've been wanting to do a podcast story about moonshine in Georgia because we were still busting stills here in the 80s.
Yeah.
It's okay. So, and then it was Jim Trott, who was our former mayor of Pine Mountain. He said, "You need to read this book." And he gave me like a list of books, and that was the first one on the list. So somehow he knew about it. I think that was before you did some marketing or something, because I had read it last year, and then all of a sudden I starts hearing all these other people are reading your book. And of course it's a local thing for us,
Yeah.
John Wallace is buried in the city cemetery, a block from the history center, basically, almost. What made you decide to write Moonshine Over Georgia?
There was one seminal moment when I was about 11 or 12. My grandfather, I knew he was a revenue agent. I started having some knowledge of that probably by the time I was 6 or 7. And of course, as a young boy, I already worshiped my grandfather, and I was just fascinated with his law enforcement days. But you usually had to kind of pull things out of him. He was a very modest person. He didn't like to talk about himself a lot. But on this particular day, we were watching the Andy Griffith Show, and a character came on named Rafe Hollister, who was only on about 5 episodes, but you can easily Google him. And one of his traits was he was the Mayberry area moonshiner. So the skit they were doing on the episode was Otis was trying to buy moonshine from Rafe Hollister. And my grandfather got more and more agitated. And he just reached up all of a sudden, and that was back when you had an actual switch on your television. He slapped off the TV. And I always called him Pop. I said, "Pop, what's wrong? Aren't we going to finish the show?" And he looked at me, and he had tears in his eyes. And I had never seen him cry. He was a pretty tough guy. even just in day-to-day life. But he said it wasn't like that, son. He said there was nothing funny about the moonshine business. He said you may think you've heard a little child cry, but you haven't really heard one cry until you've heard one that's hungry cry. And he
Mm.
said, I've dragged kids, fathers out of ditches, sick off of bad moonshine or drunk off of good moonshine, and taking them home to some little shack. He said, you can't even fathom the poverty that was prevalent in Georgia back then in the 30s and 40s. And you take the father home to some little shack, and the children would be running around out in the yard at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, crying because they hadn't eaten all day and their bellies were hurting them. And he said, and then daddy just spent what little grocery money they had on a gallon of moonshine. Those little children would hold onto my leg and just wail. And he said, it's a cry you never get out of your mind. And then
Mm.
he just started saying over and over, and I couldn't help them all. I couldn't help them all. And then he just started sobbing. And he and my grandmother had been married around 60 years at that point. They bickered about all kinds of things. But that day, my grandmother pulled an ottoman over and sat with my grandfather and held his hands while he cried. Even though I wasn't a writer at that time and didn't really know I was going to be a writer, somehow subconsciously I knew I would tell this story someday.
Right. And I remember listening to you at the women's club. I think you had said that you had found, like when you were doing your research, didn't you have a box or something that you had found of your grandfather's that had information in it?
Yeah, and I've got it sitting right here. It's really just a metal fishing tackle box, but he used it like a strong box and kept it locked with a padlock. And so when Murder in Coweta County came out as a book, he read it, but he was not happy with a lot of things in it.
Mhm.
And Margaret Barnes, who wrote it, and I'm not disparaging her, but she had made an appointment to meet with my grandfather, and she should have, because he knew probably a lot more about the case even than Sheriff Potts did, because he had been investigating Wallace. This was his second time investigating Wallace. He'd been around Wallace for over a year by the
Mm.
time the Turner incident happened. But anyway, when the movie came out, I went to his house to watch it. And he said, boy, what are you watching that crap for? He went
Mm.
to another room and came in there and saw me watching it. And I said, Pop, this is awesome. You might be in the movie, which he wasn't. He was in the Margaret Barnes book briefly a couple times, but he wasn't in the movie. And he said, all them Hollywood people don't know nothing. He said, when you get finished, you come back to my room. And he went and did something else. He didn't even watch that much of it. And
Mm.
so when I went back to his room, he got this metal box out and he riffled through the papers for a minute and he pulled out a handwritten note from John Wallace. It was written in pencil on a piece of notepaper. And it said, Agent Miller, it is urgent that we speak. Meet me at my barn at midnight. Come alone. The cover of my book depicts that midnight meeting. My grandfather did go to the meeting. My mother, who was still alive when I was researching the book and actually just passed away last year, and got a chance to read the whole book, she can remember the night that he went to the meeting and how much her mom
Really?
was crying and she was crying and they were begging him not to go because they thought Wallace was going to kill him. And
Wow.
my one of the guys that I interviewed, we could talk about in a minute. I interviewed a moonshiner that my grandfather arrested from Upson County, and he told me, and this was a man, this moonshiner ended up serving in World War II in the infantry, but he said your grandfather is the only man I ever knew that I would call fearless.
Mm.
And so my grandfather went to the meeting, and that meeting is depicted on the cover art of my book, and it kind of kicks off the story. It's in chapter 4, so there's some background in the first 3 chapters, but those move along pretty quickly. And then once you get into that meeting with John Wallace and my grandfather, then my story really takes off.
Yep. And it's fascinating. I loved it. And I know the book is a historical novel, but what I found interesting when you were talking at the presentation, but there were some assumptions that you made in the book that you later discovered were true.
Yeah. One of those was a major part of my book. I thought I was making up fiction when I decided to make my grandfather have a pre-existing relationship with Wilson Turner, who would later become the victim of the crime. So I wrote my book that way. I really wrote the first and second drafts in 2015. Not until 2017 did I discover, through corresponding with another author named Dot Moore, who's written a couple of nonfiction books on this case and on Mahalia Lancaster. We
Hmm.
started swapping notes, and she was able to share with me the murder trial transcripts, which I had not had before. And in those transcripts, my grandfather testifies for quite some time. And I found out that he did indeed try to get Turner to become his informant. He did know Turner for quite some time before, I mean, like for 2 years before any of this incident with Wallace even occurred. So there was that pre-existing relationship. And in my book, in my fictional plot, I'm doing air quotes around the word fictional. Um, I made this still that I thought was make believe. I put it on White Sulphur Springs. I went down to the area. I did some hiking around. I looked at maps and just trying to decide, get the feel for the setting of the book, but also I wanted to figure out where I wanted to put this mythical still. And
Hmm.
I saw White Sulphur Spring, and I love that name, so I put it on White Sulphur Spring. So in the trial transcripts, 2 years later, after the book was really completed, I read my grandfather's testimony, and the district attorney asked him, "Now, where was Turner Still that he had on the side when you tried to get him to be an informant?" And my grandfather said, "On White Sulphur Spring."
Wow.
So I still get chill bumps telling that, because I don't believe in communicating with the dead, but somehow my grandfather was communicating with me when I.
Yeah, exactly. Was there a fact that you uncovered that didn't make it into the book? Was it something like you discovered later that you wish you could have added or anything like that?
I've got a big one, but
Is
I
it
don't
gonna be in
know.
your sequel or something?
It may be in the sequel.
Okay.
And I'll tell you what, every time I come to your area, which was my former home, and I
Mhm.
grew up mostly around West Georgia. Every time I come down there, I connect with another person that has a really deep connection to the case. And not all of them are elderly. Some of them might be, in their 40s, but they know something through their family heritage or through their family lore about it.
Mhm.
And a lady came up to me at the Cotton Picking Fair, an African American lady,
Mhm.
and she was very nervous. And I thought she was wanting to approach me, but she was kind of standing off at the distance, so I wasn't sure. But then all of a sudden, it's like she got up the courage and she rushed over to me, and she took both my hands in hers. I'd never seen her before in my life, and I've never seen her since. And she said, "You were the first one that had the courage to tell Mark Anthony's story." And she said, "I know that's not his real name, and it's not. I changed his name, as I promised my grandfather I would if I ever wrote about it." And she said, "You were the first one that had the courage to tell his story." And she said, "Thank you." And she hugged me. And then when she hugged me, she whispered something in my ear, which I promise I'm going to put in the sequel. And it is mind blowing.
Woo, I can't wait. Wow.
When I spoke at the courtroom, which was the day after I spoke to you ladies, um, a gentleman came very early. He had a walker, and he had a lady helping him that may have been his daughter, but she was in her 70s. And she came up to me. Nobody was there yet. And she came up to me and said, he came early because he wants you to come talk to him. So I went over to the gentleman, and he said, "Son, I'm 92 years old." He said, "When I was a little boy, I sat right up there in that balcony and I watched your grandfather testify." And that
Oh,
just gave me chill bumps. And he said,
wow.
"My mother brought me to the trial several days." And he said she really kind of was uncomfortable with me being there because of what they were talking about, but she wanted to go and she didn't have anybody to watch me. So he said, "But being at that trial inspired me, and I grew up to become an attorney." And then he said, "I was ultimately a judge in this very courtroom. I sat on this bench." So that was just amazing.
Oh my gosh. Amazing. I'm curious because I'm an avid audiobook person. What do you have an idea of what percentage of your book sales are audio versus, the hardback or paperback book?
Yes. I keep up with all that really close. About 35% audio.
Okay.
Most people still prefer the paperback.
Right.
I will do more audiobooks, and I hope I get to use that same actor again because he crushed it.
He was phenomenal.
My mother read the man. She was my first reader. As soon as I felt like the manuscript was really ready for prime time, I wanted her to be the first person to read it. And she did not have dementia at that time. And she called me after she finished it, and she was crying. And she said, Chris, it's not like you wrote a story about my father. It's like you channeled my father. And she said, you wrote about scenes that I lived through as a little girl, and it was like you were in the room with us at the time, which, of course, it was all decades before I was born. But she said, I can tell you hung on every word my father said because she said, you got his pattern of speech perfect, everything. So that was the first really great review I had. But then when the audiobook came out, she unfortunately was suffering with dementia and it was pretty severe. And so we had a nurse that stayed with her all the time, or a sitter, and my mother couldn't concentrate to read. And so the nurse started playing my audiobook for her. And my mother had not spoken in a couple of days because of the dementia. But when she played the audiobook, she said she played about half of the part where my grandfather starts speaking. And she sat up in bed and she said, my daddy's here.
Mm.
So, two things. I nailed my grandfather's voice so much. When I talk about voice, I mean pattern of speech as a writer, that she recognized it completely, even with dementia. But also, the actor nailed his way of speaking so closely that it resonated with her that much.
It's the best compliment in the world. That
Yeah.
was amazing. And you'll have that memory forever about how
Yeah.
how much she enjoyed that. Well, before we end today, I want to just, I'm going to put some links in my show notes of where we can purchase your book, or yeah, I know you have a Facebook page. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that, and then I'll include it in the show notes.
Yeah, I'm in a transition, and I got you asked me a good question a while ago, and I kind of got off on a tangent. The sequel I hope to have out sometime late next year, but it takes longer just because I'm doing so much marketing of the books I already have. This is Moonshine Over Georgia is actually my fifth book, and I would love for people to go buy all my books, and they can do that by going to Chris Skates author on when you go to Amazon. If you were shopping for a widget or anything from Amazon, in that search bar on Amazon, just type in Chris Skates comma author, and all my books will come up. And I do have a brand new collection of short stories and essays, some of which are humor stories that just came out a couple weeks ago. But Moonshine Over Georgia is there. My book, The Rain and the Tower. Unfortunately, right now, the only audiobook I've been able to produce is Moonshine Over Georgia, but I do hope to do audios of my other books at some point. My next book is going to be the one that I'm currently working on is going to be called Moonshine and the Three Governors. That'll be the sequel to Moonshine Over Georgia. And that will take the reader from the after the Wallace trial until my grandfather got kicked out of law enforcement by Governor Herman Talmadge,
Ooh.
which is a really, even though it makes me mad, is a very interesting story how it all transpired.
Okay.
But and then the main villain in Moonshine and the Three Governors is going to be based on a real guy named Fat Hardy, who was a moonshiner in Atlanta. So, but then I want to write a prequel, which will take my grandfather from boyhood until how he became a revenuer. And that is going to take place in Central Florida, where he was from. He was from a little community. I don't know if I said this in the ladies' club or not. He was from a little community lost in time called Evanston. It's still there.
Mm.
The general store that was the store when he was a little boy in 1910 is still the store. It's not,
Where is it, north or south or east or west of Orlando? Do you know?
I don't know. It's closer to Gainesville. So it's
Okay.
Micanopy.
Oh,
Uh,
I love Micanopy.
okay, it's right there next to Micanopy. It's about 8 miles.
That's amazing.
So the general store is the oldest continuously operating store in America, and it's still in business.
That I can't wait for your next books to come out. That's going to
And,
be
and
great.
so it's got the title of that will be Education on Fish Prairie. Now, I want to pay you a compliment. I think it is so great that you're doing this podcast, and that you've got such a great sense of community.
It's about bringing the history of the of our town out of the history center and into the community.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
between that and my Our Town trivia thing I do and the podcast and the walking tours, it's about getting people excited because there's so many really good things in the history center and they just don't realize how fun it is when you go in, the inscriptions on the jail cell walls and all of
Yeah,
that.
that was neat. We went there the other day when we were in Pine Mountain.
Yep.
And I was really happy to see you at even though I'd never met you before, I was really glad to see you at the women's club because that women's club was so charming to me. And it reminded me so much of my own mom and my own grandmother. They loved things like that. And
Yep.
the little cucumber sandwiches. And I mean, it was just a Southern charm as it could be.
Well, this has been great. I really appreciate it, especially, with all the scheduling conflicts, but I so appreciate you joining me today. Chris was such a great guest. His book is fascinating, and hearing the real life stories that inspired it made it a truly memorable conversation. He also had great things to say about our town, which I really appreciated. If you're not from around here, the book touches on the same time period and events as Murder in Coweta County, the true crime story turned TV movie with Johnny Cash, Andy Griffith, and June Carter Cash about the 1948 murder of Wilson Turner and the conviction of John Wallace. Most locals know it well, but for my listeners tuning in from Colorado, Washington, or even Minnesota, yes, now we have hit 27 states. That little history might help connect the dots. And if my voice sounds a little off, it's because I've been under the weather. But I'm getting better. This episode was brought to you by the Pine Mountain Tourism Association. With cozy restaurants, charming shops, and streets that feel straight out of a Hallmark movie, Pine Mountain offers the perfect small-town escape. Explore the Man o' War Trail, spot wildlife at the Wild Animal Safari, hike the multitude of trails at FDR State Park, or unwind at the beautiful Callaway Gardens. Warm welcomes, scenic views, and something for everyone. Discover Pine Mountain. A new tradition has sprouted in downtown Pine Mountain. We invite you to shop fresh, support local, and soak up the small town charm at the all-new downtown Pine Mountain Farmers Market, happening every Saturday from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Vendors include from fresh fruits and veggies, homemade jams, breads and baked goods, local honey and fresh-cut flowers, and handcrafted gifts and artisan wares, and so much more. Special thanks to Chris Skates for his insightful interview today. The beautiful art and music for the show was created by Sillybug Studios. My next episode will be in a couple weeks. Hope to see you around town.